Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. The objective of this video lecture is to present an introduction to studies, to language studies. Language studies is a subject which is broader and larger than modern linguistics. It simply means all the ways of thinking about language and analyzing language and studying language, starting from its forms of representation, including the orthography, punctuation, and so on, to its philosophical aspect, like, for example, the origin of language, or speaking about the properties of human language, or the relationship between language and thought. Language studies also include aspects of the structural system of language, starting from the sounds, sound combinations, the words, and word combinations. It also includes other aspects of language, like the artistic or the stylistic and the rhetoric forms of language, such as discourse analysis. It also includes the semantic of language, the pragmatics of using language, and how language is used in social context, in different environments, how the meaning is conveyed, how it is received. Part also of language studies is what is called the teaching of language in applied linguistics, and how language is acquired, how it is learned by either native speakers or non-native speakers. So all these aspects of studying, analyzing, thinking about language are included within what we call language studies. So as you can see, these are different and broader than what is included within the domain and the field of study of modern linguistics. To present an introduction about the language studies, I have opted for a historical approach. What do I mean by historical approach? It simply means the techniques of presenting information in teaching or in criticism about a topic, starting from its early stages, following its evolvement through history, until you reach its actual and subsequent developments. I repeat, a historical approach focuses on the beginnings of an issue or a topic, and it follows its development throughout history until you reach its actual state. And I see that this approach is interesting in teaching because it gives an insight to students to how the issues began, their origin. Also, it gives an insight about the main concepts and how they started and how they evolved. It also gives an idea about the approaches which were used before and how they developed. And it's interesting for the students to know the issues which were discussed before and they are still discussed now, how they started and how they developed. It's also important to know about the concepts, their evolvement, their etymology, their original and authentic meaning, and how they changed throughout history, And it's also important to know about the beginnings of the approaches and the methods and how developed they are developed until they reached the actual state. So it's quite plausible to look at the beginnings of language studies to see how it appeared, how it developed until it resulted in what we know today of modern linguistics or before traditional grammar. So to see the very beginnings of language studies, I have found that it's for the sake of organization to speak about how they began in Asia and in Europe. These two parts of the world recognized the beginning of language studies, though in different stages in the history. So in Asia, when we speak about the beginnings of language studies, we automatically are going to speak about the Indians in India, Panini, and the Arabs, and how they developed their language studies and their traditional grammar. And when we go to Europe, it's quite plausible to speak about the Greeks, the philosophers in Greece, and their inherits, the Romans. So the first point to speak about concerning the beginnings of the language studies is to see the reasons why scholars in India or the Arab scholars started language, the reasons behind their concern with language, and the reasons why the Greek philosophers and the Roman philosophers were concerned with language. And I will continue using scholars for the Indians and the Arabs and philosophers for the Greeks and the Romans. And this is the convention, okay? Concerning the reasons why the Indians were concerned with language and also the Arabs, it's mainly a religious reason. They were interested in studying language because of a religious reason. What's that religious reason? For the Indians, they wanted to study their sacred book called the Veda, or the Vedas, depending on the pronunciation. For the Arabs, they were concerned with the Quran. So their interest is not, or was not, to study language for itself, but to study language so as to understand the sacred books, so as to preserve their language, which was concerned as a sacred language, and so as to allow to other nations to learn and study their languages if they convert to their religions, both with the Arabs and the Indians. So for these reasons, these nations were concerned with the studying and codifying language. Of course, the Indians were very much prior to the Arabs. People speak about 6 to 12 centuries before Christ, when the first book of Panini was written. There were a lot of discussion concerning the beginning, whether it's 12 years before Christ, or 6 years before Christ, or 3, or 5, or 4. All you can find in literature, all these dates. But the majority of references speak about between 3 to 5 centuries before Christ, when the first book of grammar due to Panini appeared. The contributions of Panini to grammar started with his classifications of sounds into voiced and voiceless, and this was not an easy task at that time. Today we have machines, we have spectrograms, we have a lot of means to distinguish between voiced and voiceless sounds, but in those days they just depended on their feelings, on their experience in life, on their hearing. So this is the first contribution. The second contribution of Panini was his classification of the parts of speech into nouns, verbs, particles, and additional units. Additional units are language units which are different from nouns, different from verbs, different from particles. Also, his classification of tenses into the past, the present, and the future. Concerning the Arabs, the first person or the first grammarian or scholar who was reported to be interested in language studies was Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali. He was interested in studying and codifying the Arabic language for the same reason, for a religious reason, because he wanted to preserve or to contribute in preserving the language of the Quran, which is the Arabic, the Qurayshi variety of Arabic, and other varieties which were included in the language of the Quran. His contributions mainly were on the specifying the abjad letters and distinguishing between them by the addition of the dots, because as we know the letters in Arabic were written before without dots, but later on Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali added dots to the abjad letters, and he has also invented the vocalic decoratics, al-harakat al-i'rabiyya, like al-raf' wal-nasb wal-jazm wal-jar, so as to mark the case or other states of the words, nouns or verbs in Arabic. He has also contributed to grammar by distinguishment between nouns, verbs, and particles. So the parts of speech in the Arabic grammar are 3: nouns, verbs, and particles, al-ism wal-fi'l wal-harf. And the parts of speech in the Indian tradition were 4: the nouns and the verbs, the particles, and then the additional units. Were the Arabs influenced by the Indians? This is a question which is most of the time asked, and we don't have an agreement among scholars whether yes or no. Concerning the Arab scholars, whether ancient or modern Arab scholars, the majority of them, they deny that there was an influence of the Indians or the Indian scholars on the Arab scholars as to the grammar of Arabic. But there are, on the contrary, some Orientalists who claim that indeed the Arab grammarians were influenced by the Indians, especially when they compare some issues in grammar, like the parts of speech, like the classification of sounds into voiced and voiceless. In Arabic grammar we say مجهور ومهموس. And like also the classification of tenses into past and present, okay, الماضي والمضارع. So they say these might be indications that the Indian grammarians influenced the Arab grammarians when they started codifying the Arabic language. By and large, the Indians or the Arabs, both of them were primarily concerned with studying language just for religious reasons, and then later on came other civilizational, communicative reasons via which they developed their grammars and all the language studies at all levels of language analysis. So this is the first reason why scholars in India and the Arab Peninsula were concerned with studying language. If we move now to Europe, we find another reason why philosophers were concerned with studying language. In the Greek philosophers, and then later on the Romans, were concerned with language mainly for a philosophical reason. The concern with language is just part of the concern with the existence of human beings in the universe. The question about the origin of the human beings, their characteristics, also has extended to some of the properties of human beings, which is language. Hence, the expression of homo loquens, and hence also the expression which says that human beings are just talking animals. So language is one of the main properties of human beings. So the Greek philosophers were concerned with studying language because they were concerned with the human being as a whole. So by analogy to the question of the origin of the human being and his properties, they also asked the question about the origin of language and its properties. Some of them said that language is created by the human beings. It's agreed upon among people, and those who are called conventionalists. Some others say no, language is a gift from nature or from a supernatural power. So it's not a convention. By the way, the same dichotomy is also found in the Arabic tradition, and it is called the difference whether language has an origin which is tawfiq or tawqif. So tawqif is natural, tawfiq is conventional. So those who say, or some of those who say that language has a natural source or origin, they say that language is full of anomalies, which means irregularities. And those who say that language has a conventional source or origin, they also claim that language has a lot of analogies, meaning a lot of regularities. So Plato was one of the naturalists and the anomalists. And Aristotle was one of the famous conventionalists and analogists. The outcome of these discussions is the beginning of systematized language studies. So, to speak about anomaly and analogy in language means that you have to do some analysis of language structures, language meanings, language conventions to prove and to back up your position. And that was the beginning of language studies and the beginning of traditional grammar. But the first systematization of language studies and traditional grammar in Europe after the Greek philosophers came with the Romans, especially with a group of philosophers who were called the Stoics. The Stoics were interested in language for the same reason, for a philosophical reason, and they were mainly concerned with how human beings can live in harmony with nature. They were concerned mainly with how human beings can live in harmony with nature. So they say, if human beings want to live in harmony with nature, they have to acquire knowledge. And part of knowledge, in fact, an essential part of knowledge is language. So they should know language exactly. They should know the true meaning of words, the structures of language, and the components of language. For them, when they say knowledge, they mean philosophical knowledge. So if you want to live, for example, in harmony with nature, you have to know the exact meaning of some words, like, for example, freedom and liberty. What does it mean exactly? Or justice, or obedience, or parents, or just some aspects of nature that you have that are surrounding us, like rivers, trees, and so on. If you know the true meaning of these concepts, you are you have more tendency to live in harmony with these, with your environment and with nature. Hence, their concern with language, and that's why they started to study the etymology of words. They started to distinguish between transitive and intransitive verbs. And when you distinguish between transitive and intransitive, then you are going to study passive and impassive or active constructions. They also contributed by having a list of parts of speech, because the parts of speech in European languages developed. We said earlier that with the Indians they were 4, with the Arabs they were 3, but with the Greeks and the Romans, the parts of speech were mainly 8, though the list of the parts of speech differ from one philosopher to another. They agreed upon the verbs, the adjectives, the nouns, the prepositions, but they disagreed upon other parts of speech. Another group of the Greek and Roman philosophers who were interested very much in language, and they contributed too much in developing language studies and traditional grammar, were called the Alexandrians. The Alexandrians were a group of philosophers who lived and worked in Alexandria in Egypt. At that time, Alexandria has the biggest and the largest library in the world. So they were dealing with a lot of manuscripts a lot of versions of literature, poems, especially the famous poems of Homer's, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they had different versions. So their objective was how to find out the most authentic version of these texts. So they started to compare between the varieties they have, because those texts were written in different historical periods, so the varieties they contain were different. So they started to compare between the varieties of the Greek language and the Latin language, and they started to compare between the differences which exist between the scripts, between the manuscripts. So when you compare between the manuscripts, this means that you are going to, you are obliged to know the structure of language, to know the structure of the sentence, to know the meaning of words, to know the difference between verbs and nouns, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, and so on. You are also obliged to know the difference between tenses. So thus they started codifying the grammars of their languages, and they started to improving that grammar because they needed it in comparing between the versions they have of the sacred and literary texts. And they started writing notes on the margins of those manuscripts, and thus they contributed too much in developing traditional grammar and language studies. Now, let me look at the approaches which were adopted at that time. Basically, the early approaches that were adopted were of two kinds: the famous deductive and inductive approach, and also the analytic and synthetic approach. What do these approaches mean? The deductive reasoning or approach means that you start from a general statement and you examine the possibilities to reach a specific conclusion. For example, when you say all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is mortal. Here, we have started with a general statement, and this statement is supposed to be true. All men are mortal. And then we go to the second step and we say that Socrates, since it is a man, he is also mortal. This is the conclusion. So we have started from a general statement and we have reached a specific conclusion. So deductive reasoning starts from general to specific. The inductive is exactly the opposite. You start from the specific and you aim to reach a general statement. For example, when you say, the coin I pulled from the bag is a penny, the second coin is a penny, the third coin is a penny, so all the coins in the bag must be pennies. This is what we call inductive. You start from considering specific details and you want to reach a general conclusion. Concerning the analytic and synthetic approach, it's approximately the same. In the analytic approach, okay, it has to do with segmenting or dividing larger units into smaller units. For example, in language studies, when you divide the words into sounds, or when you divide or segment the sentence into words, and words into morphemes, morphemes into phonemes, and so on. This method works with languages which are studied for the first time. You need to adopt an analytic way of reasoning, and that's why we still find it, this method, okay, associated with the American structuralism. The second approach is called the synthetic approach. It basically says, I have a lot of little pieces. How do I put them together to come up with a theory? So this question presupposes that you already know the pieces and you already know the units. So in fact, there is a complementarity between the synthetic and the analytic approach. There are some remarks, okay, that are leveled at the end of this presentation. First, I would like to say that the Indian and the Arab scholars were mainly using or mainly known for using inductive and analytic method. The Indian grammarian scholars and the Arab grammarians and scholars, when they conducted their study to language, they used inductive and analytic methods. Concerning the Greeks and the Romans, they were known for the deductive and the synthetic method. That's why they were famous in theorizing, in coming up with theories concerning language. But all these approaches brought two important consequences. Language studies at that time focused on two varieties of language: the ancient varieties and the written varieties. Concerning the ancient varieties, they were considered as being more authentic and more formal than the latest varieties. Concerning the written language, it was focused on as it was considered more correct and more authentic and more formal, whereas the spoken language was just considered as a corruption of the written language. This conception of viewing language has or had a repercussion on the approach, which became very prescriptive. And a prescriptive approach simply means to describe language not as it is used by native speakers, but as it should be used. These methods of looking at language continued and lasted until the period of the Renaissance. In this period, the first seeds of what we call today modern linguistics appeared with new approaches, with a new conception of language, which is nowadays studied not just for the sake of religious and philosophical reasons. In addition to religious and philosophical reasons, we find language is studied for purely linguistic reasons, for economic reasons, for civilizational reasons, for communicative reasons, using more empirical and more scientific approaches. And this will be the subject of our next lecture. Thank you, and see you then.